So I have no PowerPoint. I just thought I would riff on some thoughts on the theme, and then hopefully I can land near the bottom of the hour. Is that cool?
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much.
Cool. So the title of this session was "Stealing the Culture with the Metagame," and I'll explain what stealing the culture means and how I hold the metagame in a moment. I thought it'd be good to introduce myself and what I'm currently doing to set up both of those kind of phrases. So I was a corporate trainer. This is before COVID came online. A corporate trainer living in Toronto, Canada. I was training at Dale Carnegie training. That how to win friends and influence people. It's all about kind of interpersonal skills, social dynamics, stuff like that. And I was also kind of a Stoic. I'm a practicing Stoic, and I ran the Stoic group here in Toronto, which became like the largest Stoic group in the world. So those two sort of things I was doing here in Toronto. And basically, 1 year ago when COVID came online, I started this online place called the Stoa. And this 1 year anniversary is actually happening this Sunday on March 21st. And it's not about Stoicism. Like 99% of this stuff is not Stoic. The frame is that a digital campfire. So basically an online event space. A lot of the events happen on Zoom. And we have a wisdom gym. So there's a lot of reoccurring events like breathwork sessions, various intersubjective modalities. I don't know if people are familiar with circling or collective presencing, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And I think Tyson Wagner is coming to do some freestyling here, and we have like freestyle in our wisdom gym that's repurposed towards sense making and expressing our truth and stuff like that. And it's also, so that's one aspect of the Stoa is this wisdom gym. And the other aspect is like a communal podcast. Peath was there talking about the metagame. We had Noam Chomsky, ContraPoints, even Alexander Dugin, the late James Carse, who wrote Finite Infinite Games, which I'll mention in a moment. And I think even Toby from Squad Wealth, he's following me. He was there at the Stoa as well. So that's kind of a gist of what the Stoa is. And I will touch on it a little bit in a moment. But that phrase, steal the culture. So my colleague, and as a professor at University of Toronto, John Vervaeke, he's sort of became famous in the last year or so doing that online YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And his whole thing is like, we're in a meaning crisis right now and we got to awaken from it. And when he came to the Stoa, when it started, I think it was back in April, his first session, he dropped this line like, I want to steal the culture from people who've been abusing us for so long. And that became like that steal the culture has became a spiritual like battle cry of the Stoa. So what does it kind of mean? And I think people in this community are familiar with the game A, game B. And when Peath came to the Stoa, he had an excellent kind of presentation on sort of the game A dynamics. Like, we are in a culture that's optimizing for profit, survival of the most savage. I think that was his words. It selects for sociopaths, basically. And then that Chinese Machiavellian who did that thick face, black heart. In order to succeed, you got to lie, have a thick face, and you got to have a black heart. You just got to like fucking be ruthless and savage. And then the economy is focused on extraction, tragedy of the commons, all that Moloch shit that the previous speaker was talking about. So that's sort of like the culture that we're in, the dominant culture. How do we steal the culture? And a lot of people talk about game B culture. What is that exactly? No one really knows, but we know it's not game A. It's not just sustainable though, but it's also regenerative. So how do we go from game A to game B? That's sort of like the John Vervaeke steal the culture. And the Stoa has been sort of one of many online spaces that has been a nexus point for a lot of these players who are interested in making this transition and stealing this culture to find each other, to find the others. And so a lot of cool cross-pollination that's unexpected has been occurring at the Stoa and other kind of digital campfires. So that's sort of steal the culture. And what is the metagame? So on the metagame, on your guys' metagame website, I think you quote the Wikipedia page and I'll read it. It's metagame is any approach to a game that transcends or operates outside the prescribed rules of the game, using external factors to affect the game or goes beyond the supposed limits or environment set by the game. And how I hold the term, and this is maybe more broad or conceptual than maybe it's used in some other circles, but to reference James Carse, who wrote the famous book, Finite Infinite Games, I think we're always embedded in an ecology of games, an ecology of finite and infinite games. Even right now, there's games at play. And then to play the metagame is to zoom out of the games at play and see the ones that are currently at play, the ones that you're being invited to play, and the ones that could be played and perhaps have the ability to unfold. So game unfolding, inviting a new game to be played. So the metagame is like the zooming out, seeing the ecology of games, and having choice, optionality of what games to play. So that's sort of the two concepts: steal the culture and then metagame. So tying these two things together, like stealing the culture with the metagame. And I think you can do this with different stealing the culture with the metagame. You can do this with various areas of focus. Like you can, focus on blockchain, decentralization, stuff like that. My area of focus is, like, for lack of better terms, social skills. like, in my background, Dale Carnegie, as I mentioned, as a trainer, I was in the kind of the pickup artist scene, and then dabbled with a lot of these intersubjective spaces, which are like, I don't know if people are familiar with circling or collective presencing. There are these kind of group, they call them intersubjective meditative practices. So there's basically, you meditate with a group together and get that sense of oneness without losing your sovereignty. And the way I like to look at it, each relationship that you enter, like kind of like in the wild or in a meeting or whatever, there's a culture that forms there. And sometimes that culture is like the game A sort of culture. Sometimes it gestures towards the game B sort of culture. And I like this idea of being able to transmute kind of the cultural dynamics from a game A to game B. Or to use another kind of distinction which maps over those categorizations is Martin Buber's I-it relationships. Like you use the other person as an instrument to use versus I-thou relationships. So you kind of view the person sort of as a mystery, and it's the relationship for its own sake. And being in an I-thou sort of relationship, or a lot of people call communitas, just naturally screens out the sociopaths. So you don't want the sociopaths to kind of get in your kind of, your culture. The capacity to be in an I-thou relationship and communitas is going to be extremely helpful. So how do you design? So how do you be a social alchemist to transmute spaces, and how can you be a communitas crafter to design those spaces? And just in the case in point, like Yancey Strick on Sunday, and the first thing he said, like, yeah, I just feel the vibe and the energy at the Stoa. It's more inviting. It's like I can kind of let my hair down. We can actually get into like generative dialogue, and contrasting to another space that he was invited into. It was sort of like this save the world space, but there's just kind of like that status oriented competitive vibe about it. So you can consciously design cultures, design spaces in such a way that engenders a new culture. So one thing that I'm interested in the next phase of the Stoa is I'd like to be more explicit about having a wisdom gym that allows these skills, these various capacities to emerge in people so people can practice it, because it just can't come overnight. You can't just like create a new technology and then expect people to have these capacities to hold space for others and not try to kind of dominate a social space. So I thought I would chat about three things, kind of cool things from three different fields: pickup artistry, anthropology, and improv. And I'll just see if I can tie them together, and then I will, if there's any questions or anything, you can ask. But I'm going to mention three concepts from these three fields that I think are important to understand in order to be conscious about designing social spaces and engendering a certain culture that is in service towards a better world of game B culture. So the pickup artists, they have something called the social nexus. So a social nexus is if you go into let's use the bar or club scene post or pre-COVID days. If you go into one of those scenes and there's a social group, there's someone in that group with a social nexus. They are the ones that are basically most socially dominant. The group orientates around them, and usually it's like a host, or in online spaces it's a moderator, or maybe it's someone who is the most fame or most status, which I'll get to in a moment. Or maybe it's just a conversational narcissist, someone who's just kind of like, asserts themselves in a scene. So the social nexus is important to spot because they're the ones that control the cultural dynamics that unfolds in that group. And the pickup artists have kind of cool techniques in order to spot them and disarm them. They call it the alpha male of the group, like disarm them. So to port that concept away from the pickup artist, because there's a lot of kind of like problematic kind of things about the pickup artist community, but that's a really helpful term to port, and a skill to spot the social nexus and be able to interact with it in such a way that you steal the social nexus role away from it and transmute it without them even noticing. Those are the skill sets in order to do that, and that can be trained. The other thing I would mention, another concept, is from anthropology. So there's this Canadian anthropologist. He went to South Africa and lived amongst the hunter and gatherers. And then when he was leaving, he bought them an ox, a big meaty ox. And they all started like making fun of him, like, oh, that skinny ox. Oh my God, it's not going to feed anyone. And then he got like all defeated, like, oh shit, like I thought I bought this like really big ox that was going to feed this tribe, and he was all happy. And he's just like defeated. And then someone kind of came up to him, whispered, like, we do that. Like we it's called shaming the meat. And we kind of like shame this meat, because if someone comes in with this big ox, he might get a big head. He might become a big man. He might become, they didn't use these terms obviously, but he might become narcissistic. So they had a mechanism, which this anthropologist called a leveling mechanism, in order to keep the egos in check. And this is really cool, this concept of a leveling mechanism. And each kind of cultural space has its own leveling mechanism. And some could be broken. So then like just kind of like the ego, the narcissist take over. Some leveling mechanisms might keep like people in check, but it could be pathological. It could neuter people's potential at the same time. So you want a leveling mechanism in place that kind of keeps the arduous egos in check, but at the same time allows each individual member to potentialize. So it's cool to spot the leveling mechanism in play, and when you're designing spaces, to design a leveling mechanism that affords what I mentioned. And then the last thing I'll mention, which is cool, is status. So I have acting background and improv background. And if anyone who takes improv, you learn the language of status. So I'll give you one of the exercises that we did in the status games. So imagine there's 10 people in the room, and each person is asked to play, like, let's say status is a scale from 10 to 0. So if you have 10, you're super high status. If you're 0, you have low status. So they asked everyone in the room to walk around and play at 10. And so people who played at 10 was like, they fucking puffed up their chest, walking around like Conor McGregor, just like, walking around the room, just really felt powerful, like you're the fucking boss in that environment. Then they asked you to play a 0. And then you're kind of like hunched back, not looking about in the eyes, just walking very slow. Then you actually play a 5, then a 7, and then, a 4. And so you're feeling what it's like to play higher level or lower levels of status in your body. Then the next part of that exercise was that they gave, like, let's just say for argument's sake, there was 10 people in the room. They gave everyone a number. This person was a 3, this person was a 10. And then they couldn't show the other person their number. But then you ask them to interact with each other for about like 20 minutes. So everyone's not telling them what number they have, but they're acting as that number in a normal organic conversation. So someone's acting like, like the 10s, other people can't look at each other. And so it's a funny dynamic. And then you tell them to stop after 20 minutes. And then you say, line up, 10s here, 0s here, and line up in the order you think your number was at. And that obviously the 10s and the 1s will or 0s will know where they go, but everyone's consistently lines up in the same order: 10, 9, 8, 7. And this exercise, and I'm doing this multiple times and playing it, really shows you that status is a language that's already being spoken, and it teaches you how to speak this language of status. And the guy who came up with improv, who basically invented improv, Keith Johnstone, he wrote this book Impro in the 1970s. He actually came to the Stoa. You can check that out. And when I was talking to him, he said that the one thing that's really fucking cool when people learn about status is that bullshit status games stop being played. So you have the players, the improv people who know kind of the language of status. They don't do that one-upmanship game anymore. They just kind of like just talk like normal human beings, because it's like they're all disarming each other and they can spot each other out easily if they're playing that game. So I mentioned all this in service: social nexus, leveling mechanism, status. These are components amongst many other components that can be learned and taught in such a way that affords people to become more sophisticated, to interact in certain spaces, to transmute unhealthy dynamics, and to create their own spaces that engender culture that is more healthy and regenerative. And I think this is important because when you're designing, you're discussing things like blockchain or decentralization or any other things that is needed in this world. If it's coming from an unhealthy pathological culture, it's going to influence it in ways that might not be known and might not be expected. So yeah, that's kind of like the thoughts I had to share. So I'll pause there and happy to answer any questions. And I think we're almost at the bottom of the hour too. So
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Let's see, is there some feedback? Oh, there we go. Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for coming in and telling us a little bit more about kind of culture and how we can create it and use it to define our spaces.